published by IVP, as has his very recently published book, just literally over the last few weeks, Right to Die, Euthanasia, Assisted Suicide and End-of-Life Care. We have several copies of that with us at the back this evening to buy, if you'd like to do so, at a reduced cost of £7. That's a whole £2 less than the price offered by a well-known online seller. Take advantage of that this evening. John is a great friend to us here at LICC. He served for many years as one of our trustees. Apparently, he was first brought onto the board as a representative of young people. And here he is now addressing end-of-life issues. So go figure. But those who know John know him as someone for whom this is not an abstract theoretical debate. Those of you who know John will know him as someone who's deeply compassionate and profoundly sympathetic about the lives of real people. And so I commend John to us this evening. Please welcome him with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Well, thanks very much indeed, Anthony, for that warm welcome, and it's a great privilege for me to be here. I'm afraid it's not going to be a fun topic. We're going to be looking at death and dying and suffering and suicide and terminal illness. But I hope that it isn't totally going to be a grisly and painful experience, and that we can also think about what it means to die well and to die faithfully in the light of the Christian faith. Is there a Christian answer? Is there an answer within the Christian narrative to these deep fears which are so common in our society? As all of us know, and as Anthony said, the newspapers seem to be filled with a regular stream of tragic cases. One was that of Daniel James, a very promising young rugby player, played for the England junior team, and then he was involved in a tragic accident, fracture at the base of the spine, at the cervical spine in his neck, paralyzed from the chest downwards. He was a very sporty lad. He thought the idea of spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair was just totally unacceptable. And then he persuaded his parents, if you really love me, you'll help me to kill myself. And at first his parents tried desperately to persuade him not to do it, but in the end they agreed with him and they took him to the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland, where he was given a lethal mixture of medicines and died shortly afterwards. And the publicity was largely positive. What noble parents, what courageous parents. They didn't put their own interests first. They wanted to do the best thing for their child. And Mary Warnock, well-known moral philosopher, supported them and said, well, how ridiculous that he had to go all the way to Switzerland to kill himself. Why couldn't we have this facility available here? Another tragic case than that of Tony Nicholson with a rare medical syndrome called the locked-in syndrome. This is due to a stroke at the base of the brain, which has the effect of knocking out all the connections which allow us to move our body, while the consciousness and the sensory awareness is all completely intact. So the person is literally locked in their body, often not able to do anything except possibly blink an eyelid. There are probably about 100 people with this syndrome at any one time in the country. Interestingly, the vast majority of them are not trying to kill themselves. In fact, they're desperately clinging on to life and desperately trying to communicate and be engaged with their loved ones and to make whatever the best they can of this very tragic circumstance. But Tony Nicholson became depressed, and he felt that the best thing for him was if he could kill himself. But actually, he was physically incapable of killing himself. He just literally couldn't do it. And so he claimed that anybody else in the country, they could, if they wanted to, have killed themselves. He was unable to do it, and so he went to the courts and argued that it was his human rights were being infringed because he couldn't kill himself, and that a doctor should have the right to kill him at his request without the doctor being at risk of prosecution. And the case went to the appeal court and hung by quite a narrow margin. But in the end, the appeal court decided that this was really a matter for Parliament to change the law, and that it couldn't make a case law precedent. And so in the end, Tony Nicholas's case was refused. He was said to be completely distraught at the news, and it sounds as though effectively he then starved himself to death over the next period of several days, and he died of natural causes. More recently, just this last summer, another case, again taken rather at random. Jeff Spector, this chap on the right, was a self-made businessman. He'd done pretty well for himself. He had a good life, and then he was diagnosed with an inoperable tumor on his spine, which was, as it enlarged, it was likely to press on his spine and cause him to become paraplegic. He would be unable to walk. He'd probably be in a wheelchair. He might become incontinent and so on. And Jeff Spector said, "That's not the life I wish to have." And so he called his family and best friends together for a celebratory meal, and there they are having a celebratory meal. That's him on the right. And he then announced to the gathering that actually he was going to go and kill himself the following week, and he went off to Zurich and was killed. And again, the publicity by and large in the newspapers was quite positive and saying, what a noble and responsible thing to do. He didn't want to be dependent. He didn't want to be a burden to others. He wanted to live well, and he wanted to die well, and it was his choice. It was his right. As you probably know, although both assisted suicide and euthanasia are illegal in this country, there are one or two places across the world where they are now legalized, and in particular the Netherlands is the place which has where euthanasia in adults is legal, and it is in fact becoming relatively routine for people with advanced cancer to receive euthanasia. Approximately about 3% of all deaths that happen in the Netherlands are reported as being due to euthanasia, and up to another 10% happen with a technique called terminal sedation, which is something that's practiced in Holland but not in this country, where people are put to sleep using medication for days on end by an intravenous drip, but they're not given any food or fluids. And then eventually, after usually a week, 10 days, people will die basically of dehydration and starvation. And this is called terminal sedation. And the doctors say, well, it makes them feel better. It isn't the same as like a lethal execution where you just inject the drugs and the person dies. I would want to argue that the intention is to kill. It's simply that in this case, death happens by omission, by failing to give food and fluids. But it seems clear that the intention of the whole process is to bring life to an end as swiftly as possible. In the Netherlands, over 90% of doctors, in fact, something like 95% of doctors say they're in favor of euthanasia, mercy killing, in terminal cancer, and a very small percentage, less than 5%, would refuse to do it or to have any involvement. The big debate that's going on in the Netherlands is about other examples, particularly euthanasia for people with psychiatric problems and also with dementia. And there's some quite disturbing recent data showing quite a significant rise in the number of people with chronic psychiatric disorders who are receiving euthanasia in the Netherlands. And the pro-euthanasia lobby group in the Netherlands has set up a clinic for patients whose own doctors are not prepared to do euthanasia for one reason or another. And this recent report said that in the first 6 months of this year, 18 people at this special clinic set up by the lobbying organization had been helped to die, quotes, equals killed, at a special euthanasia clinic, 18 people with severe psychiatric disorders. And as Anthony said, I've just recently been writing a book called Right to Die, which has just been published over the last 2 weeks. And in order to write that book, I did quite a lot of detailed reading and research about trying to understand what's going on in the Netherlands. And I did find it quite disturbing. I just want you to read you a little snippet, which is in the book, of an interview I read with a Dutch psychiatrist called Dr. Starkey, who works at a psychiatric hospital in the Netherlands. And she said that early in 2010, a demented woman was admitted to hospital because she was psychotic and could not return home, and she was asking to be killed. And Dr. Stark assisted her suicide with lethal drugs. And when she noticed that many of her colleagues, her psychiatric colleagues, were reluctant to get involved, were anxious about euthanasia, she decided to help out. And so she, instead of just being the coach, she took over the euthanasia request if the psychiatrist was anxious. And in the interview, Stark was asked whether the act of euthanasia was not a heavy responsibility. And she said, well, yes, as a psychiatrist, you often take heavy ethical decisions, forcible hospital admission, separation. These are not easy decisions. I find assisting in suicide an act of mercy. We do not have much to offer to people with chronic psychiatric disease. And for some patients, we can do nothing. You can fight the symptoms, reduce the suffering, and teach patients to live with it, but there's no cure available. The medicines you prescribe have unpleasant side effects. If someone says to me, this is unbearable, and that the law in the Netherlands says that you should only offer euthanasia if someone says their condition is hopeless and unbearable. She says, if someone says to me, this is unbearable, who am I to say, go on, it may become tolerable? Patients with depression or anorexia nervosa receive euthanasia relatively more frequently than other patients. In those clinical situations, it is clear which treatments to give and whether you have taken all the steps. Then you can say you've tried everything. And similarly, in Belgium, there are increasing number of psychiatric patients receiving euthanasia. And again, a report I read said that essentially most patients suffering primarily from a mental disorder are physically capable of suicide. So some people have argued, therefore, it's not really necessary to provide assistance. If they can kill themselves anyway, why should we be assisting them? But the argument from the psychiatrist was, if no assistance is provided, the patient may be more likely to attempt suicide in lonely, difficult circumstances and in a risky and violent way. Such patients may run the risk of failing in their suicide attempt and instead harm themselves seriously and permanently. So once the legal requirements for assisted suicide have been met, assistance with suicide may create the opportunity for a more humane method of suicide. Furthermore, the prevention of violent suicide can be seen as a measure to protect people who might become accidentally involved in and traumatized by the patient's suicide. We can do it in a clean way, which isn't going to cause terrible grief to others. So it does seem that although the numbers are small, this idea that helping psychiatric patients to commit suicide in a clean and medically approved way might actually be seen as an argument of compassion is really taking hold in the Netherlands and in Belgium. There's been a big debate about what about people with dementia? And again, following a number of reports in the Netherlands and so on, it's been generally accepted that if patients are in the early stages of dementia and say they wish to be killed, then that would be an appropriate reason for doctors to carry out euthanasia. However, the official Dutch Medical Association position is that you have to have a medical reason to have a request for euthanasia, because there are a significant number of people now in Holland who describe themselves as, quotes, tired of life. And they don't necessarily have a medical condition, they just feel it's time for them to end their lives. So far, the official position is that they will not qualify for euthanasia in Holland because they haven't got a medical condition. But it's interesting that a survey of 1,500 Dutch doctors in February 2015 reported that 18% would now consider helping someone to die even if they had no physical problems, but were tired of living. So I think the argument that this gradual extension of assisted suicide and euthanasia from cancer and what most people think of as terminal illnesses towards psychiatric conditions, towards dementia, and even possibly towards people who are, quotes, tired of life, that progression is something that you really can see slowly taking places in places like Belgium and the Netherlands. And it's also noticeable, one of the things that struck me reading about the situation in the Netherlands is that there's really quite an open publicity about self-help methods for people who wish to kill themselves. So a well-known psychiatrist, Dr. Chabot, made a film explaining how someone can kill themselves using helium gas and the various other lethal combinations of medicines. And one of the people involved in the campaign in favor of euthanasia stated that she believed the taboo about death had diminished since euthanasia had been legalized in the Netherlands. The subject has become a part of life. A result of this is that people really want to be in control. I increasingly see self-help methods being discussed. So in the book I do discuss some more of this evidence, but I must say I was really quite shocked as I read the data about how the situation has just changed literally in the last 2 or 3 years in the Netherlands and in Belgium. Another trend is to make euthanasia available to children, and in Dutch, the Dutch Pediatric Association has said that children with terminal illness, such as cancer, may be appropriate even under 12, provided they've expressed a wish, a desire to die. Across the world, various kinds of legislation do seem to be increasing. It's noticeable there's a difference between the kind of legislation that's going on continental Europe, particularly Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, which is concentrated on euthanasia and where the indication is unbearable and hopeless suffering, compared with the kind of legislation that's happening in the Anglo-Saxon countries, particularly in North America and in Canada, where the emphasis is much less about suffering. In fact, suffering isn't really a primary argument at all. The emphasis is entirely on the right of self-control, on autonomy, and the only qualification is that you have to have a terminal illness. And provided you have a terminal illness, then you qualify for having the right to be given lethal medication. And in fact, it was that form of law which was being discussed in the House of Commons relatively recently, and I'll come back to that shortly. What is clear is that if you go out to the general public as a whole and you ask them, do you think people should be given help to die, or some equally vague question, then the vast majority of people, surprise, surprise, will say yes. And different polls have been done with different questions, but by and large, if you phrase the question in a rather vague and euphemistic way, then as many as 80% of the population has said, yes, we think the law should be changed. It's interesting, if you change the question, or if you tell people that there might be risks then about changing the law and give people some information about that, then the percentage drops very significantly. So one of the interesting phenomena in this area, which interests me, and that is that every doctor knows there's a huge difference about talking about these issues when you're in the best of health versus what it's actually like in the middle of the night when you receive some catastrophic diagnosis. So if you ask most people how they think they would respond if they were given a diagnosis that they had some terribly advanced disease and they probably only had weeks to live, if you ask people in the pub with a pint in their hand, then the commonest response you get, well, I'd say, Doc, I've had my life and it's been a good life, and if your number's up on it, well, then you just say, okay, keep me comfortable, I'll have as much morphine as possible, thanks very much, I won't struggle. That's the almost universal answer you'll get from people in the pub. in reality, what most doctors realize, and I had a spell working in part of my training in cancer medicine oncology at Bart's Hospital, where I was actually often giving people in the middle of the night this catastrophic news that they had advanced leukemia, that it was the kind that was not easily treatable, and there was a very good chance, unfortunately, they were going to die in the next few weeks. However, we could give you this horrific anti-leukemia treatment. This is many years ago. And I gave a graphic description of all the terrible things this treatment did to you, but there was about a 5 to 10% chance that you might actually respond, and it might give you some extra months or even a year or two. My experience was that virtually every single patient that I gave that option to went for the treatment. When it was actually me in the middle of the night, life was precious, and I was prepared to go through the most horrific risks and unpleasantness if it would give me the possibility of some extra months or years. So these things are very different when it really is our neck on the lines. And this is part of the problem with discussing these kind of issues with the general public as a democratic process. And what's interesting is that the further you are away from actually being in the situation of dealing with dying patients, the more likely you are to be in favor of euthanasia and assisted suicide. As you get closer and closer to dealing on a daily basis with dying patients, the less likely you are to be in favor of a change of the law. So in general, doctors are much more opposed compared to the general public, and if you take specialist palliative care doctors who deal with dying patients all the time, then in studies over 90% of palliative care doctors are opposed to a change in the law. So paradoxically, the closer you get to the real situation, the more likely it is that you will actually vote against changing the law. It's interesting that actually cancer is no longer the issue which most people are most afraid of. And dementia has replaced cancer as being the most feared way to die. And yet, tragically, we know that dementia is common and is increasing. Because it's basically an age-related disease, the older you are, the greater risk you have of developing dementia. And because we have an aging population, then the statistics demonstrate that your risk of developing dementia goes up, and therefore the total number of people with dementia in the country is likely to accelerate dramatically. So the projections in the UK are 800,000 people in 2012, 1 million people with dementia in 2021, 1.7 million people, 1,700,000 people with dementia in 2051. And so as this apparent epidemic of dementia is facing us, people are saying, how are we going to survive as a society? And would it be reasonable to say perhaps some form of assisted suicide, helping people who wanted to kill themselves? And there are some people arguing, not many. Interestingly, there's a mismatch between what people say in public and what the sort of thing that people say in private. And I've noticed that many people in private would say, well, actually, I personally am quite in favor of euthanasia for demented people, but would never say it in public. One person who did have the courage to say it in public, well, courage or unwise, depending on your viewpoint, was Mary Warnock, who was quoted as saying this: if you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the NHS. I'm absolutely fully in agreement with the argument that if pain is insufferable, then someone should be given help to die. But I feel there's a wider argument that if someone absolutely desperately wants to die because they're a burden to their family or to the state, then I think they too should be allowed to die. But of course, we need to remember that these are not just theoretical philosophical issues. These are issues of human pain. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that pretty well every medical ethical issue at heart is an issue of human pain. It's about human beings who agonize and suffer and worry and bleed and die. And so we must never reduce these kind of discussions to sort of abstract philosophical, theological debates. If you like, I think we should talk about these issues not with rhetoric and with philosophical judgment in our voices, but with tears in our eyes, recognizing the intense pain, the agony of a Tony Nicholson or of a Daniel James. But also, of course, these are not just issues out there in society as a whole. These are issues in here, in this room. I don't know anything about nearly all of you, but I can guarantee there are many people here who've been personally touched by some of these issues. You may have watched a loved one die, maybe in a very unpleasant and painful way. You may even know that you yourself have a terminal diagnosis, or you may be worried that you're at risk of developing dementia. Or you may have had suicidal thoughts and wondered whether the best thing to do would be to kill yourself, even though perhaps you've never told anybody else. So these are issues not just out there. They're issues which touch all of us because of our own humanity and our frailty and vulnerability. But just as a discussion question, I'd like to pose this question back to you and ask you perhaps to turn to your neighbor and just very briefly discuss this question. What are the social forces and trends in our society which are changing people's attitudes towards death, towards suffering, towards suicide and mercy killing? What are the underlying forces? Why is it that 80% of people say that they're in favor of some form of assisted dying? So would you like to turn to your neighbor and just discuss just very briefly this among yourselves? Some water. Great, thanks.
Suddenly the room seems a lot fuller than when I stressed it.
Well, I'm sure we could spend a fruitful half hour discussing some of these deep social trends, but there'll be opportunity perhaps to raise some of these things in the discussion time. I'm going to outline a few things that I think are relevant. One of the interesting things is that as a society we've lost the belief that suffering and pain and discomfort can have any kind of positive value at all. Any form of suffering, pain, discomfort is seen as entirely negative, entirely destructive, and something to be obliterated in any way possible. So it's very interesting that for modern people, often anesthesia is the best possible good. And it's quite common to hear people say, just put me out, doc. I just don't want to know anything about it. Just put me out. Just put me to sleep. That's fine. And if you ask people how they would wish to die, I wonder if you can predict what the commonest answer you will get. The commonest answer you will get is, I want to die in my sleep, I want to have absolutely no warning, no awareness, no premonition, no anxiety, no sense. I just want to go pip like that. No, nothing about it. Wouldn't that be wonderful? What a wonderful way to die. As I look around, I can see one or two people nodding their heads sagely. And yet, you know, if you were to go back 300 years and you were to ask the same question, the overwhelming view would be that sudden death was a terrible way to die, an evil way to die. In fact, there are many prayers in the medieval period and so on, which was specifically against sudden death. To be catapulted into eternity with no possibility of preparing yourself to meet your Maker, no possibility of saying goodbye to your loved ones, no possibility of making restitution for where relationships were broken or of evil things that you'd done, no possibility of saying your final words, no possibility of commissioning the next generation, just to go out. What a terrible thing, with no warning at all. So isn't it fascinating that what so many people now think is the best possible way was previous generations would have seen as something quite evil. And I think it actually reflects the enormous individualism and selfishness. We don't give a damn about other people. Just as long as we go nicely and quietly and not knowing, nothing to worry about, then what happens to anybody else is none of my business. And it's that kind of individualism, richly. But a moment's thought actually tells us that to die suddenly isn't necessarily the best possible way to die. And certainly, perhaps previous generations knew more about it. But I think the biggest cause probably, or certainly one of them, is the argument for choice and control over how we die. And one of the very influential organizations in this whole debate is this one, Dignity in Dying. It used to be called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, and the Voluntary Euthanasia Society was a rather dodgy outfit which used to tell people how to kill themselves by hoarding tablets and using plastic bags and so on. And then they had a complete makeover, and they changed their name. And of course, the change in name is highly significant. They've become extremely well funded. They're well supported by celebrities and private donors. They have a large professional staff. They're, for instance, considerably bigger and stronger than the Christian Medical Fellowship, of which I'm a part. And their main role, in fact, their sole role, is to get the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia in this country. You would think, with a name like Dignity in Dying, they were committed to helping people, improving the care of dying people. But in fact, the implication is the only way you can have a dignified dying is by assisted suicide or euthanasia. And it's very interesting just to see, if you go onto their website and just see the language that is used. It's all about your life, your choice, greater choice, control, access to services, a dignified death for all, patient choice at the end of life. So it's very much the idea that everybody should have the right to choose the time and the manner of their death. To any modern people, the idea that you cannot choose the time and the manner of your death seems absolutely absurd. Yeah, I can choose anything else about my life. I can choose where I live, what I work, how I spend my time. I have complete freedom in all these other respects. Why can I not choose the time and the manner in which I die? This is simply medieval, that I'm not allowed to do this. And therefore it's blindingly obvious that ultimately we have to change the law to help people control. But it's also very interesting to see the language that is used, and the language is so often misleading and euphemistic. So these are the sort of words that both Dignity in Dying and other pro-assisted suicide and euthanasia campaigners use. Words like ensuring a dignified death, the right to die, the right to choose, easing the passing, assisted dying, choosing to die, easeful death, ending suffering when it becomes unbearable. All these phrases are referring to serious criminal activity, either an offense against the Suicide Act of assisting somebody to kill themselves, or homicide, intentional killing. But isn't it interesting that in their literature they never talk about suicide, they never talk about killing. They use these euphemistic and often deliberately misleading terms. Assisted dying sounds so friendly and so nice. In fact, what is very unclear for those except those who actually understand the medical details is that what is being proposed in assisted dying is completely different from what palliative care doctors do. So when the doctors in the Netherlands first started intending to kill patients, they didn't know how to do it. It wasn't the sort of thing that you get trained at medical school. And so they experimented with a number of grisly things, like injecting air into people's veins and giving them huge doses of insulin and so on, none of which worked extremely well. And it took them some time to work out how to do it. And what they eventually worked out is by giving an absolutely massive dose of a barbiturate, up to 100 times the therapeutic dose, and then combining that with other drugs which were intended to stop vomiting, and also sometimes drugs which cause just complete muscle relaxation. They paralyze all the muscles of the body. That lo and behold, that's a highly effective and very quick and clean way of killing people. And those drugs are completely different from the drugs that are used in palliative care. In palliative care, doctors use opiates, which are powerful painkillers that are not dangerous lethal drugs, and they use a different kind of sedatives. They never use barbiturates, except for very specific reasons. They use a group of drugs called the benzodiazepines. And the thing about the benzodiazepines is they're amazingly safe drugs. You can take a massive overdose of benzodiazepines, go to sleep for 72 hours, and wake up and feel absolutely fine. And that's the reason that the palliative care doctors use those drugs, because they are not intending to kill. They are helping dying people without trying to kill them. So there's actually a huge difference between what is being called assisted dying, but in fact is intentional killing at one remove, and what palliative care doctors do. So I like this ancient proverb: the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. And so for clarity, we do need to be clear about what we're talking about. And so euthanasia is intentional medical killing. The idea is to introduce death into a patient who is not actively dying. And you do that, as I've said, by giving a massive overdose of a lethal medicine. And the idea is to kill as quickly and cleanly as possible. And in fact, you can kill by commission, by giving a massive lethal drug, as we've just done, which is what normally happens in the Netherlands. But you can also, as I explained before, kill by omission, by putting someone to sleep for a week or 10 days, but not giving them any food or fluids. The intention is to kill, and the end result is that the patient dies, but the technique is not one of commission, it is one of omission. But morally, seems to me the two actions are very similar. And assisted suicide is intentional killing at one remove. The doctor calculates the lethal dose. The doctor makes sure that the medicine is available. The doctor actually gives the medicine to the patient. The doctor explains how the medicine should be taken, explains that you've got to take this liquid, you've also got to take an anti-sickness medication, you've got to remain upright to try and minimize the prospect of vomiting, etc., etc. The doctor gives all these grisly details to make sure the patient kills himself, but then hangs back from the final act. The doctor says, you've got to take the tablets yourself. But the intention is clearly that the person should die as quickly and as cleanly as possible. And can the doctor claim, well, it was none of my business, I was just an innocent bystander? I think it's pretty clear that morally the doctor is just as involved in the intention to kill. But euthanasia is not the same as withdrawing or withholding medical treatment, which is futile or burdensome, or where the patient is actively dying. So here, death is already in the room. The patient is already dying, or the patient is receiving, death is being held at bay by some invasive medical treatment, and switching off the medical treatment, allowing death to occur naturally, is not the same as intentional killing. In fact, it's good medical practice. In my own medical practice as a pediatrician, on many occasions, I felt, after discussion with the parents, the right thing to do in this tragic circumstance of untreatable illness was to switch off the life support machinery because the baby was dying and allow nature to take its course. And to carry on giving futile and unnecessary treatment, keeping the patient alive and with no hope of recovery, that can actually turn into a kind of abuse, a kind of medicine can turn into a harmful and damaging kind of activity. So there is a time to say enough is enough. And the way we do it is by balancing the benefits and the burdens of treatment. If treatment can bring benefits, then we should give it. But if the burdens of treatment outweigh the benefits, then we should switch off the life support. We should stop the invasive medical treatment. That's not the same as intentional killing. Similarly, euthanasia is not the same as giving pain-killing treatment in order to benefit the patient, which may have the unintended side effect of shortening life. That's called the principle of double effect, and it recognizes the difference between intention, what I'm trying to achieve, and foresight, what I see might happen. So for instance, when I was a cancer doctor, as I said, I used to inject some of these horrific anti-cancer medicines into people's veins. They were so toxic and unpleasant, I had to wear gloves and protective clothing to protect myself against this stuff which I was injecting into people's veins. I knew perfectly well what the consequences of this treatment was. I knew that it rotted the bone marrow, that it damaged the heart muscle, that it caused the hair to fall out, etc., etc., etc. I knew that there was actually a risk that the treatment itself might lead to death. And I'm sorry to say that some of the patients in whom I injected these horrible medicines, they did actually die as a result of the medicines I injected. So what kind of horrific homicidal maniac was I let loose in the cancer department? Well, actually, for some strange reason, I wasn't locked up and taken to the Old Bailey and charged with homicide, because my intention was to heal the cancer, and this was an appropriate kind of treatment, but I foresaw the risks that my treatment might have. So just in the same way, if a palliative care doctor finds there is no other way to control this person's pain than by giving powerful painkillers such as morphine, then even if they foresee that that might limit their life by depressing respiration, that's not their intention. Their intention is to stop the pain. Interestingly enough, palliative care doctors say that when morphine is used properly and with skill, actually its main effect is to lengthen life and not to shorten it. And the reason for that is that morphine is such a wonderful and effective painkiller that people who are in enormous pain and distress at the end of life, once the morphine bites, suddenly their outlook changes. So, and I've seen this myself, and it's a wonderful sight. The person comes in, they're admitted, they're grey with pain, they're terrified. They say, "Just kill me, doc, just make it end. I just want to die, just make it stop." 12 hours later, the morphine's biting, their pain has resolved. They're sitting up in bed and saying, "Oh, I feel a lot better. What's for breakfast?" So that's the effect of morphine, far from this idea that it's some terrible lethal poison which is killing lots of people. Actually, when used properly, it can enhance and extend life. I've talked about the fears. There's the fear of suffering, but there's also this terrible fear of indignity and fear of dependence. To end up your life dependent on other people is seen as a terrible evil, something which dehumanizing, and much better to be able to kill yourself rather than to be dependent on others. It's interesting that in the debates that have gone on in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons as to whether to change the law, there are two principal arguments that come out time and time again. One is the argument from compassion that says you've got to be moved by compassion when you see somebody suffering. Of course, if you distill down the argument to its most crude, it says, I'm such a caring person that I have to kill you, or I have to help you kill yourself. And of course, once you put it like that, then you see that actually your compassion could threaten my life. And in fact, in the history of Europe, it's not so long ago since the Third Reich when compassion was the main argument used by the doctors for the euthanasia program that happened in the Second World War and before. So compassion is a very slippery argument, and if your compassion is threatening someone else's life, then the question is that really what we understand as compassion, or has something changed? And then the other argument is autonomy. Every person has the right to choose, as I've said, the time and the manner of their life. In the debates that were going on last year in the House of Commons, rather neatly, two prominent Christian leaders came out with these two arguments. So Lord Carey came out with the argument in favour of compassion. He said that he changed his mind, and he used to be opposed to it, but now he felt that if you were really motivated by compassion, when suffering is so great that some patients, already knowing that their end of life, make repeated pleas to die, it seems the denial of that loving compassion, which is the hallmark of Christianity, to refuse to allow them to fulfill their own clearly stated request, after, of course, a proper process of safeguards has been observed. If we truly love our neighbours as ourselves, how can we deny them the death that we would wish for ourselves in such condition? This is what I would want. So there's the argument from compassion. And then Desmond Tutu, the distinguished Archbishop from Cape Town, who played such a prominent role in the fight against apartheid, he came out for the argument of autonomy. He said he devoted himself to the dignity of the living, and now he was going to devote himself to the dignity of the dying, by which he said he meant that the law should be changed. And of course, these just demonstrate that these arguments are complex and profound, and also they tap into deep Christian instincts. We do have deep Christian instincts for compassion, when we see people who are suffering terribly, and we have deep instincts for freedom, that people should have the right to choose and be accountable for their own lives. But there's a very strange double thing, because on the one hand, you've got people promoting suicide as a noble and honourable and responsible way to die. And then we've got a huge emphasis going on in society for suicide prevention. All doctors are trained in how to minimize the risks of suicide in their patients. All police officers, all prison officers, social workers, this whole emphasis on suicide prevention is also a massive undertaking, and it reflects the sort of incoherence and inconsistency within our society, that we can be seemingly to promote two opposite things at the same time. As we all know, this issue was debated in the House of Commons in September, and many people on the inside, myself included, felt that it was actually the arguments in favour of changing the law were so strong and was happening across the world that it was very likely that it was going to happen here in the UK as well. And very surprisingly and remarkably, the House of Commons voted resoundingly against changing the law. It was a very high-quality debate. Over 500 MPs crammed into the day. It was a free vote, no party whipping, and eventually a significant majority, 3-1 MPs voted against. And interestingly, there's evidence to suggest that a significant of MPs went to the debate planning to vote in favour of the legislation, and they actually changed their mind as a result of listening to the arguments of the debate and went into the lobby and voted against. So I like this quote from H.L. Mencken, American journalist. There's always an easy solution to every human problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong. And that's what I see euthanasia and assisted suicide. It's neat, it's plausible, but it's wrong. And so I just want to briefly, in the remaining part of the talk, just talk about what I see as Christian alternatives. And I'm going to skip by the Hippocratic tradition, but I'm happy to talk about that if people want to talk about that before, about the Hippocratic Oath, because I'm short of time, and I'm going to move on to distinctively Christian understanding. So Christian ethics, the way that we're called to treat one another, comes from Christian anthropology, an understanding of what it means to be human, and an understanding of our created nature. And fundamentally is this understanding that human beings are made in God's image. We find it in the Genesis chapter 1, in that very well-known verse that God chose to create human beings. Let us, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, using New Testament language, create human beings in our image, in our likeness, as a reflection. So in Christian thinking, a human life is not just a gift. It's not just that God has given you your life as a gift. Actually, God has created you as a reflection, a map of his own mysterious being. And in the Genesis chapter 9, this ancient legal statute, which is said to be one of the oldest legal codes in the world literature, it's called the Lex Talionis. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? Because in the image of God has God made man. So in this text, as Bible expositors have pointed out, there is a linking between the shedding of blood, the ancient taboo against the shedding of blood, which most nations have, but in this legal statute it's explicitly linked with the image of God. So in Christian thinking, the destruction of an innocent human life is always wrong, not only because the wrong to the individual and the community, but also because it's a profound insult to the being and character of God himself. To deface and destroy the image of God is seen in Christian theology as an insult to God himself. So Gilbert Mylander says, within the story of my life, I have the relative freedom of a creature, but it is not simply my life to do with as I please. Suicide expresses a desire to be free and not also finite, a desire to be more like the creator than the creature. And so within this way of thinking, God has put into the cosmos, the physical structure of the universe, his own moral order. So when God created the universe, he didn't just create a physical universe, he actually created an invisible moral order, a bit like a grain of wood that penetrates through the whole order. And if we live our life according to the grain of the moral order, then our lives will work according to the Old Testament, and that's often seen as the way of wisdom. If you live your life across the grain of the moral order of the universe, then ultimately your life will fail, and that's the way of folly. And so intentional killing of an innocent human being is wrong because it contravenes the profound moral order which lies behind the structure of the universe and which is written in our hearts. And I think you see some evidence and clue of that in the responses of doctors in the Netherlands and elsewhere to performing euthanasia. Studies of doctors who performed euthanasia and assisted suicide, both in the Netherlands and USA, have shown high levels of temporary emotional discomfort, distress, and a sense of burdensomeness. In the words of one Dutch doctor, to kill someone is something far-reaching, and that is something that nags at your conscience. I wonder what it would be like not to have these cases in my practice. Perhaps I would be a much more cheerful person. Another Dutch family doctor described how he always tried to resist a request for euthanasia from one of his patients. When the pressure became unbearable, he arranged for euthanasia to be performed on a Friday afternoon. Then he said, afterwards I go for long walks in the countryside, I read poetry, I listen to Bach, and I try and get my head around it to go back to work on Monday morning. Somebody else said, it's not a normal medical treatment, you're never used to it. Another doctor asked how he felt after his first case of euthanasia, said simply, awful. Now, of course, you could say that's just simple squeamishness, which all health professionals need to overcome. But actually, I think those feelings point to a deep moral unease, to a sense of having violated a moral boundary. And they point to the hidden order of creation. When we assist in the killing of another human being, however compassionate and rational our motives might be, we come up against the moral order of the universe, and we damage our own humanity. So it's interesting that in the Bible and in all societies influenced by Christianity, suicide is never glorified as a noble or honorable way to die. It's always seen as an act of despair, an act of hopelessness. Think of the people in the Bible, people like Saul, King Saul, or Judas Iscariot, where suicide is never seen as a noble. In many other non-Christian cultures, suicide has been seen as the death of a warrior, the noble death, the death of a gentleman, the responsible death. The Stoics, for instance, celebrated the noble and honorable suicide. But in Christianity, self-destruction is a harm to be avoided, not a human right to be assisted. Having said that, suicidal thoughts seem quite common in God's people. So Elijah says, "It is enough, Lord, take my life." But God doesn't say, "Okay, then I'll wipe you out." Instead, Elijah is sent on a sabbatical. And Job curses the day he was born. And many other Old Testament characters are overwhelmed by despair and grief. But God doesn't see that, therefore, as a reason to take their lives. So, in fact, suicidal thoughts are quite common in God's people. And I'm quite sure there are people here who've had suicidal thoughts. And I have to be honest that I went through a period of deep clinical depression myself. I ended up in a locked psychiatric ward. And at that time, I was thinking perhaps it would do everyone a favor if I killed myself and if I could just end it all. But thankfully, someone didn't turn up with a piece of paper and a pen and say, well, just sign here, we can arrange it for you. But instead, I was met with love and with compassion and with healing and recovery. So suicidal thoughts actually are quite common in God's people, but suicide itself is never seen as a noble or an honorable way to die. And then dependence. We talked about the fear of dependence, and yet, it's interesting that in the biblical understanding of what it means to be human, dependence is part of the design. We are designed to be made out of dust. That's clear in the Genesis narrative. To be made, and that means that we are designed to be fragile and vulnerable and contingent, to use a philosophical term. In other words, open to random events. And this is seen not as the consequences of sin and evil and corruption. No, this is part of the design. Presumably, it would have been possible for God to create human beings as strong, powerful, dynamic people, like the cherubim and the seraphim, whose voice filled the temple, and the very and the whole temple shakes. They're so powerful, they're so dynamic. Well, God could have made us like that. But instead, he chose to make us fragile and vulnerable and contingent. And we come into this world utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. When you were born, you could do nothing for yourself. Somebody loved you, somebody cared for you. We go through this phase of our lives when other people depend on us, and then we end our lives, many of us, utterly dependent on the love and care of others. And this is not seen as something terrible and evil and dehumanizing. No, it's part of the narrative. It's part of the way that God has made us. And that's why Paul says, carry one another's burdens, and so you will fulfill the law of Christ. I'm afraid, a lot of elderly people, including Christian old people who ought to know better, say something like, I just don't want to be a burden to anybody. I'm very happy to look after other people. I'm very happy to care for other people. But if I ever become a burden to other people, I'm going to say to the Lord, thank you very much. I've had my life. It's been a great life. Now it's time to go to heaven. Thank you. Goodbye. Now, if you ever hear somebody say that, or if you're ever tempted to say it yourself, you must immediately say, you are wrong. You are designed to be a burden to me, and I am designed to be a burden to you. And the life that God has given us is one of mutual burdensomeness. And we are locked together as a community in these wonderful words of John Donne. No man is an island entire of itself. What you do affects me. What I do affects you. This idea of the autonomous individual who just chooses and leads their life and does whatever they like is a myth. It's a fantasy. The reality is that we're locked together in burdens of responsibility. And yes, aging and infirmity are real. The evils of old age are real evils. The evils of fatigue and aching muscles and memory loss and all the rest. But actually, old age itself is never seen in Scripture as an evil. In fact, it's seen as a stage on the journey to be honored, respected, and even welcomed. And I wonder, whether we as Christian people, we need to learn to be more countercultural. Instead of pretending and wishing we were all 25 again, perhaps we should learn to celebrate our wrinkles and our grey hair and our flabby skin. Why? Because these are signs that we are closer to the glory. They are signs of God's faithfulness to us over many years, and they are to be celebrated and perhaps even welcomed. So Christian thinking about death is quite paradoxical. On the one hand, we fight against death as an evil, but on the other hand, we celebrate it, and not celebrate it, but we recognize it that it can be a severe mercy. It can become a journey into a better future. So death can become a strange kind of healing. So just as I come to the end, whenever we say that something is wrong, we have to immediately say, but what is a better way? It's not good enough to just say, well, killing is wrong and suicide is wrong. What's the better way? Well, wonderfully, we do have a better way. And a lot of it is dependent on this remarkable lady, Cicely Saunders, who was a Christian believer, who trained initially as a nurse, and then she became a social worker, and then she trained as a doctor. And she was convinced that there was a better way of caring for dying people. And she and a few pioneers, a completely new way of caring for dying people using medicine and providing holistic care. And these are some of her quotes. "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. Not only will we help you to die well, we will help you to live before you die." To live before you die became one of the slogans. You don't have to kill the patient in order to kill the pain. I wish that Lord Carey understood that. He says, but out of compassion, we've got to kill people. It isn't true. You don't have to kill the patient in order to kill the pain. So in palliative care of the dying patient, the intention is neither to accelerate the death process as much as possible, nor to impede it. It's instead to allow death to occur naturally and to concentrate on using those last few hours and days and weeks to the maximum. And Cicely Saunders invented this concept of total pain. She said not only is there physical pain, but there's also psychological pain. There are anxieties and depression and worry. There's relational pain, those broken relationships, those fears and anxieties about families and relatives. And there's often spiritual or existential pain. And therefore we need to address all of this pain. We need to not only just provide opiates and morphine, we need to provide talking therapy and counseling and friendship for the psychological pain. We need to actually contact that son where the last conversation was 20 years ago, and the father is dying and dying in agony because of this broken relationship with his son. And we need to contact that son and try to find reconciliation before it's too late. And we need to address the spiritual issues. So she designed St. Christopher's Hospice, a custom-built hospice, in a way so that all the beds, in the center was the chapel, and all the beds and could be wheeled into the chapel so that patients at any stage of their illness could be there in the chapel and could receive communion if they wished. And this was another of her quotes: "Suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence." In other words, yes, we can't solve all the problems, but we can be there for people in agony. We can be there for people who are in, and we can be the presence of Christ. We can be the hands of Christ with those who most need it. So I just want to perhaps just spend 5 minutes, if you'll bear with me, on asking the question, what does it mean to die well and to die faithfully as a Christian? And perhaps the first thing to say is, if you're going to die faithfully, you have to live faithfully. And so our dying should become a reflection of the way we've lived. If we've taken the way of living our lives faithfully and obediently to Christ, then we're going to be able to learn what it means to die well. And what so many people who've gone before us have taught us is that dying well is not all loss. In fact, there are remarkable and wonderful opportunities which those last hours and days and weeks have to offer. In fact, dying well can be converted by God's grace into a strange kind of adventure. Dying well is a time for focusing on the things which really matter, stripping away all those unessentials and focusing on the things which matter. A time for saying sorry and being reconciled where there are relationships that need healing. You know, that when you're dying, it's possible to have those conversations that you've never plucked up courage, that you've never found it possible to have before. Now is the time to have those conversations. A time for receiving afresh the grace and forgiveness of God. Some people are traumatized by a sense of guilt and failure. And now is the time to receive afresh a recognition of grace and forgiveness. Dying is a time for fulfilling dreams. Some people can live out those dreams. I know I've only got a few weeks left. Now is the time to do that thing that I've always longed to do. Let's not put it off any longer. It's a time for relinquishing tasks that will not be completed. I'm never going to tidy my office. I don't need to worry about that anymore. I've got other things to do. A time for learning new lessons that my Father has to teach me. A time for passing on to my loved ones the deepest concerns of the house. We've lost the tradition of the last words. You know, in previous generations, the idea that my last words were something that I said to my loved ones, to my children, to my spouse, to the people who were closest to me, and they would remember them for the rest of their lives. What I said, those last words were precious, significant, valuable. We've lost that whole tradition. A time for encouraging those who remain to serve faithfully. A time for preparing in faith, hope, and love to meet my Creator, my Redeemer, and my Lover face to face. That's really what dying well is about, that adventure of moving towards the final world. So perhaps these are some things to say at the bedside of a dying believer. I love you. Thank you for this. I'm praying for you. Please forgive me. I forgive you, and much more important, God forgives you through the death of Christ. Sometimes we just have to express the forgiveness of God's forgiveness in words. Is there anything you'd like to say to me or someone else? I'll walk this road with you to the end. We will meet again. So I'll close with this poem from John Donne. Famous poem where he says, actually, death, don't be proud, because death, you're going to die. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet can thou kill me. One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. May God help us to live well and to die well in the light of that faith. Amen.
Thank you, John. I'm very glad to have my burdensomeness to others affirmed. And I hope my colleagues here will take that on board, as well as my wife. I'll tell her when I get back home. Now's the time, folks. We're going to have a break of probably about 10 to 15 minutes. Please feel free to replenish your cups with a hot drink if you'd like to do so. Remember, if you'd like a question to be brought to John, please jot it down on that piece of paper that was on your seat when you arrived. There's a basket here on the piano at the front. And then we'll reconvene in about 10 to 15 minutes' time, and we'll pose some of those questions back to John. So over to you for a 10, 15-minute break.